When I was 17, my best friends and I were big fans of the show Jackass. We liked to make up strange dares for each other to do. However, we really didn't do a lot of the painful stuff they did on that show. We usually were just much more likely to dare each other to do scary things or play stupid pranks on other people. A lot of the time, I was able to duck the more risky dares by not daring my friends to do anything too severe in turn. This strategy, of course, could not last forever, and soon my friends noticed I never really did anything scary as they did. So, they dared me to spend 2 hours by myself in the middle of the local graveyard in the middle of the night. I tried to shrug it off like it was no big deal, but in actuality, I had always been really freaked out by graveyards. I guess I didn't really believe that strongly in the supernatural, but even without that aspect, they were already creepy places to be in. I mean, just knowing that you were walking on the ground and dead bodies were buried everywhere underneath you, that should be enough to freak anybody out, really. Anyway, the dare was that I had to go into the graveyard at midnight and stay there until 2 a.m. exactly. I had to go deep into the graveyard too. I couldn't take a flashlight, but I could have my cell phone on me, which would provide a little bit of light. My friends all waited at the gate, and I went pretty deep out into the cemetery. It was creepy and extremely quiet. All in all though, I thought I had it pretty easy. When I knew I was way out of my friends' sights, I found a place to sit down. I stared at my watch and realized I was just 10 minutes into the dare. I sat down and tried to keep myself company. After a while, I began to hear some sounds that weren't too uncommon. It sounded as if animals were scurrying around on the leaves. Occasionally, I would hear the sound of a twig breaking or something. It was very unnerving, but it was not anything I couldn't explain. After a while, however, I suddenly heard an extremely loud snap off in the distance. I jumped up to my feet just from the sheer surprise. When I did, I looked over in that direction, only to see the outline of a man standing a bit away from me right by a gravestone. It was impossible in this lighting to tell if he was looking my direction or not, but I knew that if I could see him, it was completely conceivable he could also see me. I didn't get too worried though. Actually, my first thought was that this was likely one of my friends trying to scare me. They probably figured there was nothing to really be scared of in a graveyard, circled around me, thinking they'd give me something to be scared of instead. Come on guys, this is so lame. I called out to the man. I wasn't sure which one of my friends it was, as there were 6 of us all together. Oh, I'm so scared. The figure of the man began to move towards me. They didn't move too fast either. This, in my mind, confirmed it must be one of my friends. If it really was someone to worry about, someone who wanted to do me harm, would they have been walking so slowly and confidently towards me? I called out to the man a couple of more times as he slowly walked over. I called out the names of each one of my buddies, expecting I'd eventually correctly guess which one it was. There was no answer each time, so I finally remembered I had my cell phone with me. The light was not very bright, but I thought it might be just good enough to let me make out who this was. So I shined my light on the man. Immediately, I realized this was not one of my friends. I couldn't make out his features exactly, but from what I could see, this was not anyone I knew, or anyone I ever would know. But that wasn't the worst part. I caught the light of my cell phone glinting off something he was carrying in his hands. I knew it had to be a knife. I can't explain the feeling fully, but it felt like I was hit with a sudden electric shock. I didn't wait around though. I turned back in the direction I'd come from into the cemetery and ran like hell. It didn't take long before I could see my friends off in the distance, and I was calling to them to run. They didn't though. They all just looked around very confused. I was panting by the time I reached them, but when I looked back, the man was nowhere to be seen. I tried to explain to my buddies what happened, but no one believed me. They all thought I'd just chickened out on the dare and called me a wuss. Some of them even thought I was trying to turn the dare back on them. You know what though? I don't even really care. I'd rather be a living wuss than a dead brave guy. I don't believe in life after death. I also don't really see the point of graveyards myself. I personally think that once you die, you should be cremated, and that's that. However, even though these are my beliefs, I understand that cemeteries are important to other people, and thus they should be treated with the utmost of respect. When this happened to me, I didn't have a car. I walked to and from work. I didn't mind really, but I did have to walk through a cemetery in order to get to where I was going. It was a really huge cemetery as well, and would have taken me way too much time to simply walk around. Fortunately, it was completely open at night, and they had a paved path that led me all the way through it as well. One night, I was closing the restaurant I worked in, and I was going to be the last one to leave. We stayed open until 11 p.m., so it was nearly impossible to ever get out of the store by midnight. This night, it was considerably later even, so after I locked the store up, I immediately started to head home. As usual, I cut through the cemetery. I had done this so often by this point, there was nothing frightening about doing it at all, even in the middle of the night. About halfway through the cemetery though, something really odd caught my eye. I happened to notice a vehicle sitting somewhat down in one of the rows. It wasn't just resting on the path either, which was wide enough for a car to drive on. It was sitting directly across two graves. I thought this was pretty damn disgusting. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and the last thing I wanted was to trouble with anyone out there at night though, so I decided to go ahead and ignore it. When I got to the path right in front of the car, suddenly its headlights turned on. It immediately blinded me, because they were the high beams. Of course, it was very dark outside as well. It was such a sudden brightness that it actually hurt me. I quit walking and covered my eyes. Before I even knew what was going on, the car had turned on, and they started driving directly toward me. The lights were shining right on me, so there was no way this person didn't see I was right in their way. Although I was still blinded by the lights, and I hadn't been able to recover my sight yet, I was able to jump out of the way just barely before the car hit me. They drove on by, then turned around between two of the gravestones, and came back for me. It was just horrible. Not only was this person trying to hurt me, he was also haphazardly driving over and through other people's graves. He came back towards me, and I had to run out of the way again. The guy stopped now, fortunately. I was on foot, so I was able to figure out a way to weave between the graves and get away from the man. I had to break my own ethical code and walk amongst them. I went off the path and ran, jumping over the gravestones as I went. I felt icky as all hell doing this, but the car was not a big car. It wouldn't have stood a chance trying to run over so many gravestones to get me. The person tried to follow me on the path for a while though. It was extremely scary because I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I arrived at the entrance. I was afraid that whoever this was would have me cornered once I reached it and either run over me or get out of the car to finish their goal to kill me. Fortunately for me though, the luckiest thing to ever happen in my life happened. Across the entrance from the cemetery were two police cars with their lights flashing. They weren't there because of my ordeal though. Apparently, they were just finishing a domestic situation across the street. The presence of the cars was just enough to cause the car following me to stop and begin reversing very quickly. One of the officers saw me running at the entrance and intercepted me. They had seen the strange car, but by the time I explained to them what had just happened, the guy had already sped off. I guess maybe it's not the most bone-chilling story, but it was definitely very unnerving to me. Someone driving across the bed of graves, trying to kill me as well, constantly with their high beams on blinding me in the darkness. I couldn't make out any of the details of the car because of this either. I was so upset by this that I went out, bought a bicycle, and rode around the graveyard every time in the future. I'm sure there are moments in your life that when you think back on them later on, you tend to wish you had been able to do something different in that moment. This is one of the things that bugs me the most. A few Halloweens back, I was trying to find something new and scary to do. I know it seems a little cliche, but I thought I would explore a graveyard. I myself am definitely a believer in the supernatural, and thought that if there was any place I would be likely to see a ghost, it would surely be in the middle of a graveyard. I even brought a camera and other supplies with me, since I thought I would stay out there for a long time. I got my flashlight and set out to exploring. The ambiance was extremely creepy. I had never been in the graveyard at all, let alone during the night. For the first maybe 45 minutes or so, I jumped at every single sound and saw all sorts of weird and freaky shadows and shapes out of the corner of my eye. After about an hour though, the creep factor began to swiftly wear off, and although I was still quite interested, I was not creeped out anymore. I guess I had been silly, thinking that I really would see a ghost so soon. When I didn't, I was very disappointed. After a while though, I heard a loud noise. Then I heard a lot of rustling. When I looked off in that direction and shined my light, I saw a dirty old man sprinting right at me through the darkness. Scared, I tried to warn him that I was armed. I was not, but it quickly became apparent that he was not trying to hurt me. "Help me! Help me, please!" the man called out as he caught up to me. He was very nasty looking and smelled nasty as well. I figured he was a homeless person who was living in the cemetery. I wanted to get away from him at first, and informed him I didn't have any money. "I don't need money. Someone is trying to kill me. Please, help me." Honestly, I didn't believe the man at first. I just wanted him to get away from me. But still, I couldn't just leave him there. I asked him who it was that was trying to kill him. He was unable to give me any specifics. He said he hadn't even seen who was after him. He just knew that someone was trying to kill him. By that point in time, I had been around the entire graveyard though. I knew there wasn't anyone in it but me and him. I didn't know what this man wanted, but I was positive there was no one trying to kill him. I shone my flashlight around just to appease him and let him know I could not see anyone there but us. I told him I had to be on my way and started to walk away. He would have none of it though. The man began to follow me, just raving on and on like a lunatic. I was convinced by this point that he was either a paranoid schizophrenic or having some sort of mental breakdown. I tried to get away from him, but he grabbed onto my arm and roughly tried to pull me back. I'd had enough by this point. I hauled off, knocking the guy down to his butt. I told him I didn't know what his game was, but he was going to stay the hell away from me, or he would have a big problem. While he was sitting on the ground, still carrying on, I turned and ran, making my way swiftly out of the graveyard. The following day, I was driving to work when I noticed something that scares the hell out of me to this very day. I'd seen many funeral processions driving into the graveyard in order to bury a dead body, but this was the first time I had ever seen an ambulance outside a cemetery, and they were loading a gurney into it as well. A gurney with a closed-up body bag in it. It was the first time I'd ever seen a dead body being taken out of a cemetery. Now obviously, I didn't see the body itself, but there weren't really many options of who it could have been. Either the homeless guy really was telling me the truth, and someone did kill him that night, or I was right about the homeless guy being a dangerous lunatic and he'd killed someone else who happened upon the graveyard that night as well. Either way, either prospect is way too scary for me. I've never walked through that graveyard, let alone at night ever again. This is one of my strangest stories. I'm not sure if it will scare anyone who hears it, but it was extraordinarily creepy when it happened. Growing up, I had a best friend named Bobby. We grew up in the same neighborhood basically. We began playing together at such an early age that I can't even really remember when it was. We were friends before we even started kindergarten, though I do have some blurry memories of that first day. We always got put in the same classes as we advanced through the grades as well. He was easily my best friend, and we did everything together. We both started watching horror movies at a pretty young age, much younger than anyone should probably be watching them. But don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those people who blame their problems on scary media. And I also in no way feel that they eventually influenced his actions. But we watched all of the scary movies. I'd have to say that our personal favorites had to be the Freddy Krueger films. I wish they had YouTube back in the day. Maybe the sheer content of horror videos here might have changed the way things ended up. I say that because we burned through all the movies at the store several times. Bobby started looking for something else to satisfy his hunger for horror, and the thing he turned to was serial killers. He became completely obsessed with them. It was one thing to read about them in books or old newspaper articles, but Bobby took it to what I felt were very unhealthy levels. Around this time, there was a bit of a boom in serial killer entertainment in the world. At the comic book store that we went to, they began selling books that were supposedly depictions of serial killer crimes. If that wasn't bad enough, they even had serial killer trading cards. Now, Bobby really wanted me to share in his newest obsession. I tried for the sake of my friend, but it's one thing to watch horror movies where people aren't really being killed. It's quite another to read about supposedly depicted real-life murders, or to collect special cards that list real murderers on the back as if they're baseball statistics. I just couldn't do it. And that began the first separation that me and my best friend ever experienced. Bobby took his interest pretty far. When we'd hang out, we used to do silly things. We'd play pretend that one of us was Freddy Krueger and the other one was Jason Voorhees. But now he wanted to pretend to be Jeffrey Dahmer and tie me down to portray one of his victims. I don't recall the names of any of them, and I really don't want to look it up, but Bobby knew all of them by heart. I just couldn't do that. The idea of doing it felt 100% wrong. Even writing it down feels wrong. Bobby was involved in the trading service at the time, which was advertised in his comic books. This was a few years before the prevalence of the internet. He used it to get these VHS copies of interviews with serial killers. I remember sitting through televised interviews with Ted Bundy and Bobby's personal favorite, Charles Manson. I guess he liked him particularly because he never really killed anyone himself. He influenced others to do his dirty work for him. For some reason, Bobby found that especially fascinating. He began to refer to Charles Manson as his idol. Most people, when he said that to them, just laughed because they thought he was being silly. I never laughed, though. I was the only one privy to all the information I'm telling you about, so I knew just how serious he really was. Now that doesn't mean I thought that Bobby would ever actually kill anyone. Our friendship sort of fell apart, though. The last time I spent the night at Bobby's house, we were both 14 at the time. The serial killer obsession had been going on for at least a year at that point. I was so sick of it. I brought over a Nightmare on Elm Street marathon collection I thought we could watch together. It had been a while since we'd seen them. Needless to say, Bobby was pretty annoyed with me, but I was pretty firm that this whole thing had been going on way too long. He relented, and we began to watch the movies together. I wish I could say we had a good time, but we didn't talk at all during the movies. We just sat there, and Bobby kept giving me this weird stare. I could see him through the corner of my eye. I never looked over to acknowledge him, but I knew he could tell I was nervous and that I was trying my best to avoid looking at him. Movie after movie, he just sat there and stared at me the whole time. We watched the movies with the lights off as well. He was on the love seat and I was on the couch. When we got late into the night, I got tired. I laid down, and sometime during the course of one of the movies, I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep, but when I woke up once again, the TV was off, and it was pitch black in the room. I blinked a couple of times to get the sleep out of my eyes, and then I noticed a black figure sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I was startled. I began to move to get up, and when my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw that it was Bobby. He was wide awake, sitting on the coffee table 2 feet away from me, with his eyes bulging out of his head. He had a blank expression on his face, and there was no hint of emotion at all. I tried to ask him if something was wrong, but he wouldn't answer me. He just stared at me. I told him he was scaring me. He didn't respond still. It was then I noticed something in his hand. My heart jumped when I recognized it as his pocket knife. I jumped off the couch and asked him what was wrong. He just sat there and looked at where I had been sitting, staring blankly. That was too much for me. I had to get out of that house. I didn't even take the movies with me. I just told Bobby I was leaving. He didn't respond, and I guess I really didn't give him much a chance to. I had to get out. That was the last time Bobby was my best friend. We stopped talking altogether after. The two friends who'd begun kindergarten together did not begin high school together. I saw him in the hallway from time to time, but I never stopped to talk to him. He began hanging out with some burnouts. I recall them starting a band or something. He stopped going to high school when he was 16 and ran away from home. That was back in the early 1990s, and I've never seen him since. Now I want to end this story by saying I don't believe that Bobby really became a serial killer or anything. I would be extremely surprised if he ever actually hurt anyone. There's no psychological evidence that collecting serial killer cards or reading true crime comic books can change the basic fundamentals of a man's psyche and cause him to commit murder. I don't think Bobby actually wanted to kill me that night either. He just got himself a bit obsessed with darkness and completely immersed himself in that life. It's not healthy, regardless of how you want to look at it. I hope he's okay though, wherever he is, and I hope he was able to put all that darkness behind him.